Welcome to another episode of the Snap Fantasy Football Podcast, your weekly dose of news and advice that comes to your pocket every single Saturday. Holding it down, here we got Mac, Mark, Scott, and Landon. Enjoy today's show. Hey, welcome back to the Snap Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Mac, and I'm joined by my three better parts of the show, Scott, Landon, and Mark. Fellas, today we're talking Phillip Rivers going to the Colts. Now, in my opinion, I think this was a good move for the Indianapolis Colts. I think it makes sense as to why they went out to get him. If you look at the Colts, 13th overall draft position, not good enough to get Joe Burrow or Herbert or Tua. And if you look at the free agents out on the market at the time, Jameis, Cam Newton, Andy Dalton, just not a lot of sense in going after those guys. So I think Phillip Rivers makes the most sense. Landon, I'm going to flip this over to you. Do you think that Phillip Rivers is enough to give the Indianapolis Colts the quarterbacking that they need to be successful in 2020?
So I have owned Phillip Rivers before, including on one squad last year. And just to look at his 2019 year statistically, he had 4615 yards, which is pretty high and actually pretty standard for him. He also had 23 touchdowns and 20 picks. 20 picks is a really high number, and he's only done that twice before in his career. But that's usually offset by a lot higher number of touchdowns. So he also had a 66% completion rate, which by his standard would be not the greatest. And in watching him play last year and having him on your fantasy team, it was those tight window passes and the interceptions that kind of were the bane of his 2019 season. So the first glance when I look at him and his potential on the Colts is that he is going from a very subpar offensive line to a great one. Now, as for the continuity in the systems, the balance of run and pass, those things are changing. But the first thing that I see is that Phillip Rivers is going to be way better protected. So Landon, I'll pass it to you, and you can let us know what we think in a fantasy perspective.
I'm ready for this pass, Mark. I appreciate that. I don't mind Phillip Rivers, and I haven't minded him for a fantasy asset these past years. But typically the Chargers defense has not been great. He's needed to push the ball downfield a lot. And I know he has the ability to do that. He's a risk taker, like you said, Mark, throws those interceptions. But the game plan for the Colts is going to be to run the ball, to control the game clock. And that's not going to be what Phillip Rivers is going to be asked to do. He can come back in the game if they need to, which Jacoby Brissett lacked. But this year, I don't see his upside in fantasy football. Last year, he finished as the the quarterback 15, and Jacoby Brissett finished as the quarterback 24. And I think I have Phillip Rivers somewhere in the middle. It's a little too early so far to get all my numbers straight, but I will have him as a medium to higher end quarterback 2 in 2020. Scotty, what are your thoughts on Rivers and the Indianapolis Colts?
You know what? I like this move a lot from a football perspective. And it's funny because we were talking about Tom Brady just a couple days ago with the Buccaneers, where I said, Bucs fans must be excited because Tom Brady's coming and their win count is going to skyrocket. But the quarterback position of the Buccaneers' fantasy output is going to plummet. And I think that's the case for a lot of wide receivers around him. This, I feel, is actually kind of the complete opposite for that. I think Phillip Rivers is coming in to do what Phillip Rivers does. I think they had Jacoby Brissett for last season and were very underwhelmed with what he had to offer. I do think they're going to try to keep the running aspect that they really, had come to the forefront last season. But at its core, I don't think they paid to have Phillip Rivers come here and just game manage. I think he's going to sling the rock. And with that, I think he's going to be throwing a good amount of TDs. And like Phillip Rivers does, I think there's going to be a lot of interceptions in his future as well. So I do think it's going to be an interesting season in Indy. I think it's definitely an upgrade from Jacoby Brissett, especially from a football perspective. He's a wily vet in the kind of twilight of his career. I personally think when push comes to shove and Phillip Rivers needs to perform, whether it's in the playoffs or even, in those last few games to get in the playoffs, I think he's going to choke. And unfortunately, it's kind of been my experience watching Phillip Rivers. Most of his career is so much talent, so much passion, so much drive. But when the chips are down, he just seems to throw that ball into the arms of the other team or away. I see that happening again, but I see a lot of good fantasy points on the horizons. I love the weapons around him. If you remember this time last year, when Andy Luck was the quarterback for the Colts, we were picking them to go to the Super Bowl. And now Andy Luck is gone. Now that Phillip Rivers is the man to replace him with essentially the same tools, I have to say that I think there's a good chance this offense will hum. I think it will just come to a stop when the pressure is put on. But so from my perspective, I jump on the Phillips River train ahead of a decent amount of other quarterbacks. Mac, I know you're deep in the statistics. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. Phillip Rivers certainly has his flaws. 2019 second most interceptions under pressure. And that's always been sort of one of his tendencies. Instead of throwing the ball away, he tends to force it. And that, you know how that ends up. The problem with Phillip Rivers in Los Angeles the past couple of years, him in a clean pocket, in a clean sequence, hasn't been overly productive, as Landon outlined here. So I think, for one thing, Indianapolis fixes a lot of the problems that Phillip Rivers faces. They're committed to the run game, and they have a improved offensive line. And when I was looking back at the stats, I thought Indy's O-line was far superior than the Chargers. Actually, really close. Football Outsiders has Indianapolis as 7th in pass protection and 12th in adjusted sack rate, whereas the Chargers fall 9th in pass protection and 9th in adjusted sack rate. So fairly close. The only thing is, I think that Indianapolis offensive line has a higher ceiling. They were number 1 by a big margin in 2018, and they still have some of those pieces existing from that line. So I do think they have a more potential to protect him. Going forward, I mean, if we look at the difference between the Colts and the Chargers last year with Brissett and Rivers on their respective teams, the Colts in 2019 were 30th in passing, 29th in completion percentage, 28th in yards per attempt, and 30th in passes over 20 yards. That's with Brissett. So these are consistency, efficiency, and chunk plays, categories that I'm bringing to your attention. The Chargers with Rivers in 2019, 6th in passing, 8th in completion percentage, 9th in yards per attempt, and 10th in passing plays over 20 yards. So I think in a very comparable offensive line scheme that in a run-heavy team, Rivers has a lot less emphasis put on his arm and probably more ability to be consistent. And I think that is huge for him. I don't think that Phillip Rivers coming to this team is going to put them into that conversation of being Super Bowl contenders. But what I do think it does is allow them to get out of the basement and maybe ascend to a playoff caliber team. Maybe instead of being 7-9 at the end of the season, they're flipping the script at 10-6, 11-5. Those are totally two different things. And I think Phillip Rivers is within that realm of possibilities. So I think this is a good move for the Colts. I don't think, Phillip Rivers is going to be setting the world on fire with T.Y. Hilton and company, but I do think it's a good place for him to be a little bit more consistent than he has been with the Chargers.
One thing I'll finish off with is that the weapons that Phillip Rivers had in LA and now has with the Colts. Personally, I think it's a downgrade. I think the mix of Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Hunter Henry for a little bit really outmatches what he has in Indianapolis. Rivers used to be able to throw the ball, sling it up in the air, and Mike Williams could go get it. He's that big-bodied receiver. Right now, he's got an injury-riddled T.Y. Hilton that doesn't seem to stay on the field, and a young core with Pascal Campbell. Tons of upside, tons of speed, but just unproven assets. So that might be difficult for him to really have faith in these receivers in this offense in Indy.
Yeah, again, I don't disagree with you, but my whole argument comes back to consistency.
Right.
And that's what I think. The upside without the Keenan Allen and Mike Williams and Melvin Gordon, those guys are all not a part of his puzzle anymore. But being more consistent with Marlon Mack, T.Y. Hilton, Paris Campbell, and the list goes on, I think that's a place for him to be more consistent. So, Mark, why don't you close this one out for us?
Yeah, so one final note is that, in my personal opinion, at the end of the day, signing Philip Rivers is about as conservative of a move as any team could make when they need a quarterback. And it leads me to believe, is this team just buying time for the next big-time role filler on that depth chart?
I think so.
So, thanks a lot for watching today. Don't forget to get us on Twitter if you got questions or if you have any segment ideas for us. Hit us up on social media at snap_fantasy or leave a comment below. And don't forget to rate or review our podcast on Apple Podcasts to keep us heard. So thanks a lot.
100%. Yeah. Awesome.
That'll be it for today's episode of The Snap.